They say grief comes in waves. But when the lawyer opened my father's will, what hit me wasn't a wave, it was a damn tsunami. I remember sitting in that cold, sterile office. The air smelled like old paper and expensive disappointment. My hands were folded politely in my lap, like a child waiting to be scolded. My mother was perched beside my brother David, her back straight like a queen, her eyes hard as polished steel. David looked smuggy, always did, because somewhere deep in his bones, he believed he was the chosen one. And honestly, so did everyone else. The lawyer cleared his throat. To my son David, I leave the house at Hawthorne Hill, the entirety of my estate, and the remaining shares in Morgan Industrial. I didn't flinch. I didn't breathe. I think I forgot how. To my daughter Rachel, the lawyer continued, without even a pause, I leave this. He handed me a sealed envelope. It was thin, lightweight, listen like the silence that followed, which hung heavy as thunderclouds in that room. I opened it. There were only 3 lines, written in my father's tight, mechanical script. You have always been strong, Rachel, strong enough to build your own life. You don't need anything from me. Good luck, no apology, no explanation, just a dismissal. I looked up. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. David glanced over at me, an almost sympathetic smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as if to say, well, someone had to get less. I stood, nodded, and walked out. The receptionist didn't even look up. No one followed me. No one ever had. When you grow up being told you're resilient, what they really mean is, we won't catch you when you fall. They used to praise David for everything, the way he dressed, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself like he already owned the world. Meanwhile, I was the one who disappeared into sketchbooks and charcoal, into after-school jobs and scholarship forms. I remember once, I asked my mother if she liked one of my paintings. It was a rough piece, but it had my soul in it, like of shadow and light, a girl standing in the rain, reaching toward something she couldn't quite see. She looked at it for less than a second and said, why don't you try something more cheerful? You don't want to come across, dark. I wasn't dark, I was just unheard. David, on the other hand, could show up late to dinner with muddy shoes and a failed math test and still be praised for how much potential he has. I got an A on an English essay once, no one noticed. I stopped showing them my grades after that. I stopped showing them anything. After the will, I packed my bags that same night. I didn't even stay for the reception. My mother didn't call. David didn't text. I left with 2 suitcases, my easel, and the weight of a family legacy that wanted nothing to do with me. I moved to a city I barely knew, into an apartment that was barely livable. My neighbors screamed at each other through paper-thin walls. The heater worked when it felt like it. And the only window faced an alley where cats fought every night like miniature lions. I painted during the nights, worked during the day, temp jobs, receptionist gigs. I handed out flyers in the rain, stacked boxes in warehouses, smiled at people who didn't see me. Sometimes, I'd stare at the letter from my father and ask myself if maybe, just maybe, I had made all this up, that maybe I wasn't worthy of anything more. But then I'd go back to the canvas, back to the colors, back to the quiet place where no one could tell me I wasn't enough. You, reading this, you know what it's like, don't you? To sit in a room full of people who share your last name and still feel like a stranger. To wonder if love is a currency you'll never be rich in, to build your dreams in silence because no one ever asked what they were. Let me tell you something. Silence can be fertile ground. Things grow in the dark. Things like fire, like grit, like rebellion. I didn't know it then, but I was about to start becoming something far bigger than what they'd seen in me. Not because I wanted to prove them wrong though, God, I did, but because I finally understood something. If they wouldn't build a place for me, I'd build my own kingdom. But first, I had to survive. The next few months were brutal. Rent was a monthly cliffhanger. I sold old clothes to buy more canvas. Some days, dinner was toast and black coffee. But every night, I painted. I painted women with storms in their eyes. I painted broken buildings cradling vines. I painted myself again and again, braver, freer. One day, I brought a few paintings to a street fair, paid $50 for a booth, and hoped anyone would stop and see me. That's when he walked by. A man in his 50s, with silver hair and a paint-stained blazer. He stood in front of one of my canvases for 10 straight minutes. Then asked if I had a card. I didn't. I wrote my number on the back of a receipt. My hands were shaking. 3 days later, he called. My name's Paul Emerson. Run a small gallery in Midtown. Would you consider exhibiting with us? I said yes before he could finish the sentence. That was the beginning of everything, and no one in my family even knew my address. Not yet. The gallery was nothing like I imagined. It wasn't grand or echoing. The kind of place where critics whisper in soft contempt. No, Paul's gallery was nestled between a laundromat and a bakery. The kind of place you'd walk past without noticing unless you were looking for it, but when you stepped inside, it sang. The walls were soft white, lit with warmth instead of pretense. The art felt alive and polished, raw, aching with story. Paul curated not for prestige, but for soul. And in that space, I didn't feel like an imposter for the first time in years. He gave me the back wall, just for paintings. Choose your strongest voice, he said. I chose The Girl in the Storm, the crumbling cathedral with wildflowers in its ribs, the broken mirror reflecting gold leaf wings, and one of a faceless figure standing on a cliff, open wide, caught between the threat of falling and the promise of flight. Opening night. I wore a thrifted black dress that still smelled faintly of lavender. I stood in a corner, half hoping no one would talk to me, half desperate for someone to see me. The room buzzed with low conversations and clinks of cheap wine glasses. A woman stopped in front of the Storm Girl. She didn't speak at first. Then, she whispered, I feel like this is what I look like on the inside. She bought it. Paid in full, no haggling. Just a quiet nod, and then she walked away with my storm tucked under her arm like it belonged to her. 3 more paintings sold. That week, Paul took his cut, but the rest went straight to my bank account, more money than I had ever earned in a single month. I paid rent early. I bought groceries that didn't come in cans. I replaced my threadbare shoes, but more than that, I began to believe I wasn't delusional for thinking I had something to offer. Of course, success didn't come all at once. After the first show, there were weeks where nothing sold, where I doubted again, where rejection emails stacked in my inbox, like bricks on my chest, but I kept showing up. I painted in the early mornings before the sun rose. I painted on lunch breaks. I painted through heartbreaks and illness and exhaustion. Sometimes, I'd look down at my hands and think, this is the only part of me they couldn't silence. The funny thing about growing up unwanted is that you start to believe that love, praise, even attention must be earned, scraped for, justified. So every time someone bought a piece, I didn't feel proud. I felt relief, like I had paid off some invisible debt. Until one day, that changed. It happened. At a show in Brooklyn, Paul had introduced me to a woman named Mira, a fiery curator who ran a women-led collective focused on emerging voices in contemporary art. She was ruthless with her taste. But when she saw my newer work, bolder, messier, unapologetically chaotic, she grinned and said, finally, you've stopped painting what you think people want. I didn't know what to say. She invited me to exhibit at a larger show, one with real critics, real collectors, and real stakes. I almost said no. The part of me raised in corners, at the kids' table, whispered, you don't belong in that kind of room. But I went. And my work sold out. That was when the articles began. Rachel Morgan's Ruins of Self is a heartbreakingly honest exploration of memory, exile, and becoming a rising star in New York's art scene. The girl with fire in her brush. I started getting commissions, features, interviews, invitations to panels where I sat beside people I used to Google and envy. And then, one morning, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I was still half asleep, paint on my fingers, oatmeal in the microwave. Hello, a pause. Rachel, ... It's David. For a second, I genuinely thought it was a wrong number. My brother hadn't spoken to me in nearly 6 years. Oh, I said. Hi, I saw an article about you. The Times. You're doing ... Well. I didn't reply. I let the silence sit there like a third person on the line, more honest than either of us could be. Then he asked it, why didn't you ever tell us? Us. I almost laughed. Tell who? The mother who never asked how I was. The brother who got a mansion while I got a note. You weren't listening, I said. You never were. More silence. Then, awkwardly, I was wondering if you'd come to Mom's birthday next weekend. She's turning 5. I think it'd mean something to her. That part did make me laugh. Did it mean something to her when she watched me walk out of Dad's will and didn't even blink? Rachel, come on. That was a long time ago. People change. No, I said softly. I changed. That's why you're calling. I hung up, And for the first time, I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. You see, when you've spent your whole life trying to prove you're worthy of love, it takes years to realize that love given conditionally isn't love at all. It's a transaction. And I was done making payments. A few months later, I visited Hawthorne Hill. Not for them, for me. The house looked smaller, more brittle, like a paper castle that had shrunk in the rain. The lawn was overgrown. The shutters needed paint. The illusion had cracked. David came out the front door in a tailored shirt. "Rachel," he said, like he couldn't believe it was really me. "I'd like to talk business," I said. He blinked. "Business?" I handed him a folder. "A purchase offer. For the house. Cash." He stared at the number. "You're buying it." I smiled. "You're selling it." He didn't argue. Not really. I think even he knew it was poetic. And part of him probably respected that. When I signed the deed and got the keys, I walked into the house I'd never been allowed to feel at home in. And I exhaled. This time, it was mine. I walked the halls of that old house like a ghost, returning to its place of death, not to haunt, but to heal. Every creak in the floorboards felt like a whisper from the past. And each room carried the weight of a memory I hadn't asked to keep. The foyer, where I once stood shivering in wet shoes as Mother told me not to drip on the carpet. The dining room, where David had blown out candles on a cake I baked, while no one remembered it was my birthday too. The living room, with the oil painting of Father looming over the mantel like a portrait of judgment. I didn't come back here to feel nostalgic. I came to reclaim. This house wasn't sacred, it was a stage for silence, the architecture of erasure. And now, brick by brick, I would decide what stayed. I started with the study. It was still filled with Father's things. Leather-bound books he never read. Certificates of excellence in gold-trimmed frames. The desk where he wrote the will that left me with nothing but a sealed envelope and a ghost of an apology. I opened drawers. I pulled papers out like pulling weeds. And then I found a letter I'd written him on my 16th birthday. Never sent. Never opened. I sat down and read my own handwriting, scrawled and desperate. "Dear Dad, I know I'm not David, but I still want you to be proud of me. I just want you to see me. My chest caved in a little. Not from sorrow but from recognition. That girl still lived inside me. But she had grown teeth. She had survived. The renovations were symbolic at first. Paint the walls. Replace the curtains. Let light in. Literally and figuratively. But then came the decision that changed everything. I turned the house into a residency. A place for women artists, especially those estranged from their families, to come, live, create, and heal. No fees, no strings. Just space. I named it Second Breath. The first resident was a sculptor from Louisiana. Escaped an abusive marriage. Created towering bronze goddesses out of scrap metal and rage. The second was a poet from Brixton. Queer, brilliant, abandoned at 19. She wrote about mothers who left and the beauty of choosing your own name. I watched them thrive in rooms where I used to cry in silence. And for the first time, the house began to feel like it had a heart. News of the residency spread. Vogue wrote a piece on it. Donations came in. A local arts council offered grants. We hosted gallery nights, poetry readings, even community dinners. The walls that once echoed judgment now vibrated with laughter and color. That's when the family came calling. First was my aunt on Mother's side. She sent a card, unsigned, but I knew the handwriting. "Heard what you did with the house. Your father would have been proud." Would he? I doubt it. But that wasn't the point. Then came the invitation. My brother was hosting a reunion. He said it would mean a lot if I came. That it was time to let the past be the past. And that Mother wasn't well. I almost didn't go. But I did. Not for them, for closure. I wore a deep burgundy dress. My hair was coiled up like a crown. I looked like everything they swore I'd never become. When I walked into the event hall, it was like walking into a play I had already seen the end of. Same faces. Same champagne. Same fake smiles. David greeted me with a hug I didn't return. "You look successful." I smiled. "I am." Mother was sitting in a wheelchair. Thinner. Then I remembered. Time had carved new lines into her face, but the eyes were the same, sharp, calculating. She looked at me and said, "So? The prodigal daughter returns." I tilted my head. Was I ever really part of the family to begin with? She said nothing. Silence had always been her weapon. But not anymore. I bent down and looked her straight in the eye. "You don't have to pretend to be proud of me. I didn't do any of it for you." A flicker of something crossed her face. Not guilt, not remorse, something smaller. Recognition, maybe. The realization that I no longer needed anything from her, not love, not approval, not inheritance. That was the real victory. The evening continued like a masquerade. Cousins I hadn't seen in years suddenly remembered my name. An uncle asked if I was still doing those paintings. A second cousin's wife tried to pitch me on investing in her wellness retreat for influencers. I didn't stay long. Before I left, David followed me out to the parking lot. "Why do you hate me so much?" he asked, like he honestly didn't know. "Hate?" I echoed. "No, hate takes effort. You were just the favorite. I can't blame you for that. But I don't forget how easy it was for you to watch me disappear." He looked down. "It wasn't easy. You just didn't do anything to stop it." He nodded. Quiet, then he said something I didn't expect. "I've been thinking of leaving the company. Doing something that matters." "Then do it," I said. He looked up, surprised. "Just like that. Just like that, because here's the truth. You don't win by becoming them. You win by refusing to." I drove home to my house no longer theirs. The moonlight poured in through new windows. The walls were warm with new stories. I sat at my easel and began a new painting. Not for sale. Not for praise. Just for me, a girl, on a cliff. Arms open. But this time, she's already flying. Success is strange when no one ever expected it from you. It doesn't arrive like a crown placed upon your head by those who once doubted you. It doesn't come with applause or parades. No, it slips in quietly, like a whisper that only you can hear, a knowing, a shift. That was the year I started getting emails from people I hadn't heard from in over a decade. High school classmates who had ignored me or laughed behind my back now reached out to catch up. Former professors who told me I was too emotional in critiques now linked to my interviews in their bios. Even an old family friend, Mrs. Lowry, who once told me art was a hobby, not a life, asked if her niece could apply to the residency. But you see, when you build something from nothing, you don't forget the silence. And when the same voices that once muted you return with their hands outstretched, calling it support, you learn to tell the difference between recognition and opportunism. I smiled at each email. I answered, politely, but I let no one in. The house was thriving. We had a waitlist of over 100 applicants. Alumni of the program were being featured in national galleries and literary magazines. One of them, a Syrian filmmaker who fled her country alone at 17, was shortlisted for a major international award. That night, as she thanked Second Breath on stage, I sat in the back row, hidden in the dark, and cried for the first time in months. Not from sadness but from knowing I had become what I needed all along, a witness, a believer. There's something quietly holy about helping someone else bloom in the same soil where you once were buried. And yet, even after all that, part of me still wanted the phone to ring. Not for an invitation. Not for validation. Just a sign. That they saw. That they knew. But the call never came. Instead, it came through a third party, David's assistant. She left a voicemail, clipped, formal. "Hi, this is Madeline. Mr. David Ellison wanted to let you know that your mother passed away last night. There will be a private family service. No press. No condolences. No emotion. Just ... Logistics." I didn't cry. I didn't go. I sat by the window that night, watching the storm roll over the hills. Thunder cracked across the sky like the earth itself was grieving someone I couldn't. I didn't light a candle. I didn't write a eulogy. But I did write something else. A letter. To the version of me that had once begged to be loved by a woman who only knew how to measure value in silence and status. I burned it in the fireplace. Let the ashes float up and away, like every word I ever choked down in her presence. Weeks passed. Then one morning, a courier arrived at the front gate. He handed me a thick envelope with an embossed seal I recognized immediately. David's handwriting. Again, inside, a letter. "I didn't know how to reach you. I suppose I still don't. I just wanted to say. After she died, I found a box. In her closet. It had your paintings. From when you were a teenager. Sketches, letters, even the one you wrote Dad when you were 16. She kept them. I don't know what that means. But maybe you will. I won't pretend we ever understood each other. I won't ask for forgiveness. But if you ever want to talk, not as siblings, but as people, I'm here." He enclosed a small photograph. I recognized it instantly. The portrait I painted of our family when I was 12. I'd drawn myself in grayscale, everyone else in vivid color. I thought it had been thrown away, but she kept it. Why? I stared at that photo for hours, not for sentiment, not for closure, but for proof that maybe even in her cold, brittle way she did see me, she just didn't know how to say it. And that's the thing about family. Sometimes the damage they do isn't in what they say it's in, what they never had the courage to speak. That night, I invited David to the house. He arrived late, still dressed like the boardroom tailored navy, expensive shoes, that faint scent of cologne that always made him seem just out of reach. He looked around, unsure. "It's beautiful," he said. "It wasn't always," I replied. We sat in the library. I poured us whiskey, the same kind father used to drink, though now I bought it for myself. He took a slow sip. "You really did it." "I did." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because no one else did it for me." He stayed for hours. We didn't talk about the will, or the past, or the thousands of small betrayals that added up over the years. We talked about art, about fear, about how strange it is to be raised in the same house and still feel like strangers. And then, right before he left, he said, "I envy you." I almost laughed. "You with the penthouse and the shareholders and the inheritance." He looked me in the eye. "You created something that wasn't about approval. You made meaning out of pain." I inherited a company. "You built a legacy." And for the first time in our lives, I believed he meant it. He hugged me goodbye. It was awkward, brief, but real. And when he left, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. Not because I'd won, but because I no longer needed to. The next morning, a new resident arrived. A girl of 20, skin like copper, and eyes like wild flame. She held a single suitcase and a notebook that looked like it had been written in tears and blood. "I heard this place saves people," she said. I smiled. "No, but it lets them save themselves." And as I showed her to her room, I realized the final truth, that the house I once called a grave had become a garden, and I was no longer the forgotten daughter. I was the root that cracked the stone. There are certain moments that arrive without warning, like a match to dry paper. It was a Sunday. The kind of day that felt deliberately slow, sunlight pouring in through the lace curtains, the scent of lavender drifting through the halls, the hush of creativity settling over every room in the house. One artist was sketching under the old cedar tree, another recording audio in the converted barn studio. I'd spent the morning editing grant proposals, sipping coffee in the sunroom, with the confidence of someone who finally had the reins. Then the doorbell rang. The intercom, not the coded buzzer. The bell. It shouldn't have startled me, but it did. No one used that bell except the postman, and even he'd learned to leave parcels by the gate. This felt different. Intimate. I stood at the top of the staircase, heart ticking a little faster. I don't know why I walked down so slowly. Maybe some instinct already knew what was waiting on the other side. And when I opened the door, there he was, my brother Matthew, the golden one, still dressed like our father, beige linen blazer, designer watch, that smooth look of ease only years of undeserved praise can imprint on a man's face. His hair grayer, his frame stiffer, but the arrogance intact. And yet, his eyes, they were not the same. "Hi," he said. My fingers gripped the doorframe. "Didn't expect to see you here, I know. Can I come in?" I didn't answer. I just stepped aside. He walked in slowly, like someone entering a cathedral where they didn't quite belong anymore. I watched his gaze travel across the foyer, land on the oil painting above the mantelpiece by a young artist from Ghana, who had painted her trauma in such tender, ferocious color it had moved gallery owners to tears. He said nothing, just stared. Finally, I spoke. "Why are you here, Matthew?" He turned to me, and I saw it then. Not regret, not apology, just need. And that, somehow, was worse. He told me the company was failing, that after our father's death, things began to unravel, that David was talking about selling off assets, that the estate was facing a lawsuit from a former partner, and the house I had grown up in, the house I had once begged to be allowed to return to, was now on the market. I stood in silence as he laid it all out, in smooth, rational, businesslike terms, as if this were a negotiation, not a reckoning. "I thought," he said carefully, "you might want to buy it." I stared at him. "You thought I might want to buy the house I was told I wasn't good enough to inherit." He didn't flinch, just nodded. "Double quotes, is that all this is, Matthew? A business pitch?" He swallowed. "I didn't come to argue. I came because I thought maybe you'd want the chance." He left the deed information on my kitchen table, wrote down the price, the name of the real estate broker, The contact for the trust lawyer, no apology, no acknowledgement. Just numbers, and then he left. I didn't sleep that night. I walked the gardens. I stood in the studio, running my hands across the clay busts and paint-smeared canvases. I listened to the wind. I thought about my mother's voice telling me, "You don't have the resilience for success." About the day I'd asked for a loan to attend art school, and she'd said, "Your brother will make something of himself. You'll survive." And I had Dotto. How I had. Not just survived, but carved my name into the silence. But now, they wanted me to come back. On their terms. 2 weeks later, I walked up the gravel path to that old house. I wore all black, not in mourning, but in armor. The same gardener still worked the hedges. He gave me a long, stunned look but said nothing. The agent met me on the porch, a bland, well-dressed man with 2 white teeth and 2 short sleeves. He offered a tour. I declined. I didn't need to see it. I remembered everything. The hallway where I'd waited for my father to call me in. The library where I was told I was too sensitive to be taken seriously. The stairs I wasn't allowed to sit on during holiday parties because guests might see. The kitchen where I had once asked, very softly, if we could maybe celebrate my scholarship. And the silence that followed. I walked directly to the study, stood in the middle of the rug, and said out loud, "I'll take it." Buying that house was not revenge, it was reclamation. It was planting my name where theirs had once towered. I didn't change much. I didn't need to. The house was no longer their symbol. It was mine. I reopened it 6 months later, not as a museum to memory, but as an expansion to the residency program, a space for intergenerational artists and single mothers, for those who had never been allowed into the rooms where futures are decided. The local paper called it a bold act of cultural philanthropy, but for me, it was just coming home. Months after the opening, I got a letter, handwritten, no return address. It simply read, "I saw the article. I hope they see it too. I hope they understand now." No name, but I knew who it was from. David, maybe, even Matthew helped him write it. It didn't matter. I didn't need them to understand. The house did. The walls knew my story. The windows remembered my weeping. The floorboards echoed with my refusal to disappear. And now, every room whispered a new truth. She came back. Not to beg, not to be seen, but to build. You might think that was the end of the story. The triumphant return. The redemption arc complete. The house no longer a mausoleum to someone else's legacy, but a monument to my own. But real life doesn't tie itself up with a ribbon and a bow. No catharsis comes without confrontation. Because not long after I moved back and they came back to not to beg, not to apologize, but to reclaim. It started with emails, politely worded, distant, almost comically formal. "We'd love to host a family dinner there, for old time's sake. The space is perfect for Matthew's fundraiser. You wouldn't mind, would you? It's still the family home. After all, still the family home." I sat there, staring at my laptop, heart hammering. I hadn't realized how deep the ache still lived in me, that even now, with success and structure, with staff and press and purpose, they still assumed I'd say yes. Because I always had. When they ignored my birthday. When they cut my college tuition. When they dismissed my career as a hobby. When they read the will and left me with nothing but that letter. That was always the role they'd written for me. The quiet one. The invisible one. The one who smiled through the bruises and said, "It's fine." But I was not her anymore. And they didn't get to rewrite me. I replied simply. "The property is now a registered nonprofit art sanctuary. We do not host private events. You're welcome to apply for residency or sponsorship like everyone else. No exceptions." Their silence was deafening. A few days later, the phone rang. I don't know why I answered it. I hadn't spoken to my mother in almost 4 years, but something in me wanted to hear her flinch. She didn't say hello. She said, "You're making this harder than it has to be." I nearly laughed. "You think this is hard? Try being 19, with a rejected student loan, and a note that says you're not part of the vision. Try standing outside the hospital room where your father is dying and being told, 'Let your brother have this moment.' That was hard." Her voice didn't shake. "Not at first. You're acting like a stranger." "No, I'm acting like someone who finally realized they don't owe you access just because we share blood. You're bitter, I'm free." She went quiet. Then she sighed, as if I had disappointed her somehow. As if I was the one who had failed to rise to some noble standard. "You're so dramatic. We did our best." "No, You did your best for Matthew. For me, you did the bare minimum and still expected gratitude. I could hear the weight of years in her pause. Then, so softly I almost missed it, she asked, was it worth it? I leaned against the window pane, looking out at the gardens where a 16-year-old trans girl from Texas was painting her trauma in the form of stained glass, where a single father was composing an opera inspired by his daughter's laughter, where a former addict was choreographing his first performance since rehab. Yes, I said. It was worth everything. It didn't stop them. The subtle attempts, the invitations phrased as commands, the veiled threats hidden in nostalgia, the suggestion that maybe now that I was doing so well, I could help them. They wanted me restored to the family on their terms, to play the grateful prodigal, to hand back the house and say, you were right, I was just lost. But I wasn't lost. I had left, on purpose. And I had built something better. The press eventually caught on. A journalist from The Observer came to tour the property. She had been tipped off, probably by someone in the old circle, that a family scandal turned into a sanctuary for outcasts. But when she interviewed me, she didn't ask about the betrayal. She asked about resilience. About whether I thought this space could change people's lives, the way it had changed mine, and I said, it already has. I told her about Tasha, who'd found her voice here, about Luca, who sold his first sculpture after being homeless for 5 years, about May, whose family disowned her when she came out and who now runs our youth outreach. I didn't build this to get revenge, I told the journalist. I built this because I knew what it felt like to be locked out of the house and told I was unworthy. And she smiled. You didn't kick the door in. You built a new one. Exactly. I sometimes wonder if they watch me now, if Matthew opens the paper and sees my name attached to awards and endowments. If David sees my photo at a gala, standing beside a senator, no longer invisible. If my mother, alone in that sterile apartment, downtown, ever wonders what might have been if she'd chosen differently. But the truth, I don't care, not really, because I'm not waiting for their recognition anymore. I'm not building monuments for them to marvel at. I'm building bridges for those who never got one. I'm writing new stories, and this time, I'm the author. They say silence speaks volumes, but when it's your own sister who never once stood up for you, who watched the erosion of your worth like a quiet witness at a public stoning, that silence can feel louder than betrayal. Her name is Claire. 3 years older than me. Perfect grades, perfect posture, perfect attendance at every family event. If Matthew was the golden sun, Claire was the silk-gloved hand behind the curtain, elegant, obedient, and loyal to the family name above all else. Growing up, she was always distant. Not cruel, exactly, just absent in the ways that mattered most. I remember one moment so vividly. I was 15. Trembling in the hallway after our father told me he was cutting off my art lessons because it was time to grow up. I had run to Claire's room, hoping stupidly that she would say something, anything, to help. She looked up from her French textbook and said, you should just listen to him. It's not worth the fight. Not worth the fight. I learned, in that moment, exactly where I stood. Not a sibling, not a person to defend, just a liability. Someone she'd rather not be seen standing beside. So when Claire reached out after nearly a decade of silence, I didn't expect remorse, and I was right. Her email arrived like a ghost, formally written, painfully polite. I was in town and drove past the house. It looks transformed. I'd love to reconnect sometime, if you're open to it. I think about you often. She thinks about me often. Where was that thought when I slept in a studio apartment with mold creeping through the ceiling? Where was it when I won my first grant and no one in the family even acknowledged it? I let her message sit in my inbox for 3 weeks. Then I replied with one line. If you'd like to visit the house, you're welcome to apply for a guest tour like everyone else. Petty, maybe, but I wasn't interested in playing nice with someone who only showed up now that the paint was dry and the press was good. But Claire didn't stop. She showed up in person and announced, standing on the edge of the gravel path in a tailored trench coat and soft eyes. I didn't know where else to go, she said. I almost closed the gate in her face, but there was something brittle in her voice, something frayed, so I let her in. She walked the halls like she was visiting a museum dedicated to a version of me she didn't recognize. Her fingers grazed the banisters, her eyes paused on a photo of one of our residents, an amputee dancer, mid-leap, frozen in flight, and then she turned to me and whispered, you did this without us. I raised an eyebrow. I did this in spite of you. She flinched. Good. We sat in the sunroom. The same sunroom where our mother once told me that artists don't make legacies, they make noise. Claire clasped her hands, trying to find the version of me she remembered, but I didn't exist anymore. I'd shed that skin like dead weight. You have every right to hate us, she began. I don't hate you, Claire. I outgrew you. Silence. Then, softly, I didn't know how to help you. Back then, I was afraid. I leaned forward. Afraid of what? Standing up for me. Saying, hey, maybe our sister deserves better than a rejection letter and a locked door. Her eyes welled. And still, I felt, nothing. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. Thick, ivory. The kind our family always favored for announcements and invitations. Inside. A letter. Handwritten. Her handwriting. You were the only one who made me feel seen when I couldn't breathe inside that house. I watched you walk away. And I stayed, because I was too scared to be anything but obedient. I see now that you weren't weak, you were the strongest of us. I'm sorry I didn't stand beside you. I'm sorry I didn't follow you. I stared at it for a long time. It was not enough, but it was something. Over time, Claire began to visit, more often, not as a sister, as a student. She listened during workshops. She helped sort supplies. She donated not in her name, but in honor of a young poet she met during a session who reminded her of the girl I used to be. She never asked for credit. She never tried to reclaim the past. And slowly, I let her back in, not into my heart, not yet, but into the periphery. A familiar shadow learning how to move with light instead of against it. One afternoon, she stood beside me at the garden wall, watching a resident hammer a mosaic into shape. Claire turned and said, I still remember. The first time you drew something. You were 7. You sketched that dead robin behind the garage. I was horrified. But you, you were so calm. You made its death beautiful. I didn't respond. I just let the moment hang between us. Some wounds don't need sutures. They just need air. Redemption isn't always grand. Sometimes it arrives as a whisper, not a speech. And sometimes, the people who stayed silent finally learn how to speak. Not for you, but beside you. The first time I saw Matthew again, he was standing at the edge of the art gala I hosted in the main atrium of the house he once inherited. Black tie, of course. Expensive shoes. Smile lacquered on like he'd practiced it in a mirror, but his eyes betrayed him. That's the thing about men like Matthew. They don't believe the ground can ever shift beneath their feet, and when it does, when the tides turn, when the room doesn't bend for them the way it used to, they don't know how to stand still. I didn't invite him, he RSVP'd through someone else. Used a mutual contact from a donor circle. Slipped in the door like a stranger trying to remember a dream he once lived in. I noticed him the second he arrived. Of course I did. The way his shoulders tensed. The way he scanned the room as if he expected portraits of himself to be hanging on every wall. But what he found was my name. Everywhere. Etched into plaques. Echoed in the audio guides. Carried in the mouths of curators and founders. There was a time I used to chase that look, the look on his face. The flicker of disbelief. The dawning horror that I had not only survived, but thrived in the shadow of his imagined greatness. Now I just watched. Composed, a queen on her own ground. He approached me during the second set, while a jazz quartet played under strings of golden light. Glass of champagne in hand, smile tight, voice smoother than I remembered. Long time, he said. I turned, slow and deliberate. 10 years, give or take. He laughed. You look successful? I tilted my head. I am successful. He didn't know what to do with that. Men like Matthew prefer the illusion of modesty, so they can pretend they discovered you first. He looked around at the crowd, at the artists, the benefactors, the journalists scribbling notes. I didn't realize you were making such waves. That word, making, as if my success were accidental, an anomaly, a wave, not a tide. You wouldn't, I said. You never saw me as someone worth watching. He had the decency to look slightly embarrassed, but only slightly. Matthew, always, wore guilt like an accessory, convenient, removable. I was young, he began, caught up in expectations. You know how Dad was. He put everything on me. I stepped forward, voice steady. No, Matthew. He handed you the keys to everything, and you locked every door behind you. His jaw flexed. I didn't mean to hurt you, but you did. Over and over, and you let it happen because it kept you comfortable. He sipped his drink. I could see the mask cracking small fractures in his practiced charm. He wasn't used to being the one on the outside. "What do you want, Matthew?" I asked. "Really?" He hesitated. And then he said something so absurd I nearly laughed. "I want us to be a family again." I stared at him. He was serious. He thought showing up at my event, standing beneath my roof, in a suit tailored by money I never had access to, was enough to reset the clock. "You're confusing proximity with reconciliation," I said. "Being in the same room doesn't make us family." He frowned. "So what? You just shut me out forever." I leaned in, voice like steel wrapped in silk. "You shut me out first. For years, you stood there when they erased me from our fathers. Will you cashed the checks? You signed the deeds, and you never once asked where I ended up. You want family? That starts with accountability, not champagne." He looked away, and in that flicker of a second, I saw it. The face he made when the deal didn't close. The client didn't call back. The title didn't stick. Regret, not the loud, apologetic kind. The silent, choking kind. Because the truth had finally caught up. I was no longer someone he could explain away. I was real, visible, rooted. And he was just visiting. Before he left, he placed a small envelope on the donation table. Later, one of the staff brought it to me. Inside was a check. A large one. Very large. No note, no signature line. I folded it once, then again, and fed it into the shredder we keep for unsolicited contributions. Because I know what that money was. A bandage. A bribe. A shortcut back into a life he no longer had keys to. Let me be clear. Forgiveness is not performance. It is not a currency to be traded at galas and gift tables. It is not something you owe someone who only shows up when your name is in lights. I have forgiven Matthew, but I have not forgotten, and I will never fold myself small again to fit inside the idea of family he's comfortable with. These walls don't echo his voice anymore. They carry the laughter of those once silenced, the whispers of poems written in rehab, the applause for a girl who danced despite a limp and a scarred past. This is my legacy, not because he finally saw me, but because I saw myself first. It arrived on a Monday. Thick envelope. No return address. But I recognized the handwriting. Tight, measured, painfully formal. My mother had always written as if every word might be held against her in court. Which, in hindsight, made perfect sense when you spend your whole life performing propriety. Paper becomes your safest audience. I didn't open it right away. I left it on the mantelpiece, beneath a photograph of a student named Lena who had sculpted a portrait of her mother from broken glass. She said pain had angles and light. I waited 3 days before slicing it open, not out of fear, but because part of me wondered if she had finally said the one thing I never thought she would: "I'm sorry." The letter was 5 pages long. Not a single one contained those 2 words. It began, as all things with her did, "In defense, I've watched from afar. I know you believe we failed you. Perhaps we did, in ways that were unavoidable. Unavoidable. Like a passing storm. Like her cruelty had been the weather, and I was foolish for forgetting my umbrella. Your father had expectations, and when you didn't meet them, it became difficult. As if I had broken a contract by choosing soul over salary. We had hopes for you that you never fulfilled. That doesn't mean we stopped caring. But you made it so hard to reach you." I laughed dry bitter. As if I had been the one who vanished. As if I hadn't sent birthday cards that went unanswered. Emails that were left unread. A photo of my nonprofit's ribbon-cutting ceremony with a note: "You can still be proud of me, even if I'm not what you hoped." No response. Just silence, and now, 5 pages of veiled blame in cursive. But on page 4, something shifted. "There are nights I lie awake wondering what your life would have been if we had chosen differently. If we had let you be exactly who you were, instead of forcing you into who we thought you should become." A breath. Not quite regret, but something close enough to lean against. "Claire says the house is beautiful. She says there's laughter there, and color. I imagine it smells of turpentine and tea. I hope that's true." She paused, their ink slightly darker, like the pen pressed harder. "I don't expect you to forgive us, but I do want you to know, we see you now." I folded the letter carefully, quietly, and placed it in a drawer marked unsent. Responses, because what I wanted to say could never be contained in a reply. Later, that week, I stood before a group of students in our evening mentorship circle. One of them, Malek, 17, all sharp humor and hidden bruises, asked, "Do people ever come back to say sorry?" I thought of the letter. Of my mother, carefully crafting apologies without shape, remorse without a spine. And I said, sometimes, but not always in the way you need. Malik nodded. So what do you do then? I smiled. You build something better than their regret. You build you. Grief is strange like that. It doesn't always wear black. Sometimes, it arrives in cream stationery and ink made of half-truths. And yet, I didn't hate her. Not anymore. Because somewhere between the lines, I saw it a woman who lived her whole life in fear of being small. Watching her daughter grow into something too vast to name. The last page of her letter said, I hear you're restoring the garden. Your father planted that magnolia tree for you when you were born. I hope it's still standing. It is. And beneath it, we planted a bench. Not in his name, not in hers, just a simple plaque. To the ones who made it out. Because not all roots are worth tracing, but some grow stronger after being cut. And no, I never wrote her back. Instead, I wrote something better. I wrote grants, I wrote poems. I wrote into the walls of this house love, struggle, redemption carved in brushstrokes and clay, and the heartbeat of every soul who walked through our doors. My reply to her wasn't a letter, it was a legacy. And some legacies don't need approval. They just need to be. People love to confuse boundaries with bitterness. As if saying no is a form of cruelty. As if not letting someone back in means you're still trapped in pain. But here's the truth, they never tell you. Forgiveness without boundaries is just permission for someone to hurt you again. And I had bled enough for that family. It started with whispers. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years slid into my DMs. She's not doing well. He wrote, meaning my mother. The doctors say it's serious. I read it in silence. Felt the familiar tug of guilt trying to slip its fingers back around my throat. They wanted me to visit. They wanted me to show I was still a good daughter. That success hadn't hardened me. That I still knew where I came from, but they had spent decades teaching me to forget that exact thing where I came from. They wanted the performance of grace without the cost of accountability. I was no longer auditioning for roles I didn't write. I didn't go, I sent flowers. An arrangement of white lilies and violets. Subtle, respectful, distant, with a card that said, wishing you peace. That was it. No love, no return address, just peace. Because that's all I had left to give. You might think that made me cold, but let me ask you something. Where were they when I was sleeping in my car with a notebook as a pillow? Where were they when I missed meals because I had to pay for printing art portfolios just to get seen? Where were they when I called, voice shaking, asking for help and no one picked up? They buried me long before I ever rose. And when I did rise, they called it revenge. But it was resurrection. It was reclamation. And it didn't need their blessing. That same week, my sister Claire reached out. We hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since she accused me of rubbing my success in everyone's face. At a holiday dinner I hadn't even wanted to attend. She sent a voice note, her voice cracked halfway through. I know I haven't been fair. I was angry. Jealous, maybe, but also confused. You were always the one they ignored, ... And somehow, you still became more than any of us. I'm tired of pretending that doesn't matter. I'm tired of watching from a distance like I don't care. I played it twice. Then I sat with it for 2 days. Because growth deserves silence. Not every olive branch needs to be plucked right away. Finally, I called her. Not to yell, not to accuse, but to ask one question. Do you want to build something new? Or are you hoping to restore what we never had? She didn't hesitate. New, she said. I don't even remember what old looked like anymore. That's how we began. Coffee on a park bench. A shared journal, where we wrote letters to the versions of ourselves we failed to protect. She helped with an upcoming exhibit curated works on sisterhood and betrayal. We cried, once, during a piece called Inheritance, sculpted from rusted chains and baby shoes. We stood in front of it for a long time, no words, just knowing. Not everyone gets that second chance. Not every apology deserves a reply, but this wasn't about deserving. It was about effort, consistency, humility. She showed up not with explanations, but with presence, and sometimes, that's enough to open a new door. As for the rest of the family, they still whisper, still ask mutuals if I'll ever come around, still write passive-aggressive things on social media about the importance of family. Let them stew in the discomfort of my absence. Let them choke on the silence I used to fill with desperate hope. Because here's what they don't understand, leaving wasn't the hard part. Staying strong enough to hold that line, that's where the real healing happens. I built a life without their approval, brick by brick, breath by breath, with trembling hands that learned to shape their own peace. And no, I'm not bitter, I'm boundary rich, and I am finally free. It wasn't revenge. It was poetry. The kind that doesn't rhyme, but resonates deep in your chest. Where memory and dignity live side by side. The deed transfer happened on a cloudy Tuesday. No fanfare, no cameras. Just me, a pen, and the surreal feeling of signing my name beneath the words legal owner. The house I was never meant to inherit. The house they told me was never mine, was now under my name, and it was quiet. Not the silence of absence, but the hush that follows justice, a peace earned, not granted. Let me back up. The house had been sitting empty for years. After my father passed, my brother inherited everything, the house, the savings, the car collection, he never touched but loved to brag about. He moved in, for a while, turned my old bedroom into a gym, painted over the mural I'd drawn on the wall when I was 13. Then he got bored. He left the place to decay, renting it to strangers, then letting it rot. And eventually, in a moment of either desperation or arrogance, he put it on the market. He never expected me to be the buyer. I went through a proxy, of course, used a third-party trust, kept my name off the radar. When the final paperwork was sent to him for review, I imagine his face. The blood draining, the disbelief settling in. The realization that the girl he dismissed, the one who only got a letter, now owned the walls he was once handed without question. He texted me, "Is this a joke?" I replied with a photo, me, standing at the front door, holding the keys, smiling, no caption. He never responded. Walking through the halls felt like time folding in on itself. The echoes were still there. The ones I used to whisper into when no one listened. The rooms remembered. But I wasn't there to preserve the past. I was there to reclaim the space, to hollow it out and fill it with something new. The first thing I did, rip up the carpet in the front room. Underneath it, I found the original hardwood, scuffed and stained, but solid, just like me. We polished it, sanded away the years of neglect. And in that act, I found something I didn't expect, grace. Because sometimes restoration isn't about turning back the clock, it's about turning pain into foundation. We turned the master bedroom into a residency suite for artists fleeing unsafe homes. We converted the garage into a free community studio, with supplies donated by former students. The dining room, host to cold holiday meals filled with judgment, became a gallery of student work. Each wall now carried color, each window, light. This house would never again be a museum of silence. When people ask why I bought it, I don't say revenge. I say, I turned a cage into a cathedral. I say, I came back not for them but for every part of myself that was left behind. I say, this house didn't make me, but now, it serves me. One afternoon, while I was planting magnolias in the backyard, Claire showed up. She stood at the gate, eyes wide. I wasn't sure if you'd let me in. I shrugged, dirty hands on my hips. I changed the locks, not the heart. She stepped through. We sat under that same magnolia tree, the one planted the year I was born. It was taller now, weathered, like me. Do you ever wish things had gone differently? She asked. I shook my head. If they had, I might never have become this. She looked at the house, then back at me. You're more than I ever imagined. I smiled. I always was. You just weren't looking. And that's the thing about being underestimated. It teaches you to over-deliver, not for them, but for you. This house used to be the symbol of everything I didn't get. Now it's the living proof of everything I earned. And every time I walk through those doors, I don't see ghosts. I see growth. They didn't come to my opening nights. Not the first gallery in the city. Not the international showcase in Berlin. Not even when my name was printed across the arts section of the Times. But they showed up when it was convenient. When the headlines got louder. When the whispers turned into invitations. When success became undeniable and, worse for them, inconvenient to ignore. The exhibit was called Inheritance. Fitting right, a series of installations exploring legacy, not the one you're given, but the one you forge. Pain turned into pigment. Silence cast into sculpture. And on the final wall, a full-scale blueprint of a house. My house. The one they gave away. The one I reclaimed, and at the center of the room, a single chair, empty, painted gold, with the words carved beneath it, for the one who never got a seat at the table. They came in quietly. I spotted them before they saw me, my brother, holding a glass of wine he didn't pay for, flanked by 2 cousins and Claire. Claire looked at me, asking silently if I was okay. I was more than okay. I was ready. My brother approached, offering a familiar smirk, one I used to mistake for charm before I learned it was armor. "This is impressive," he said, eyes scanning the walls. "So this is what you've been doing all these years?" I didn't answer with words. I just held his gaze and smiled. Let him sit in the discomfort of his own question. He gestured around the room. "Some of this is about us, isn't it?" I raised an eyebrow. "Did you see your name on anything?" "No," he said, almost too quickly. "Then maybe it's not about you at all." He shifted, suddenly unsure. "But it feels like it is." I leaned in. "Then maybe you should ask yourself why." He didn't like that. People like him never do. They expect your forgiveness to arrive like a package delivered quickly, with a bow, even if they never asked for it properly. "I didn't mean for things to turn out this way," he said. And there it was. The passive apology, not "I hurt you," not "I made choices that diminished you." Just regret, floating untethered from accountability. I tilted my head. "No one ever does," I said. "But intentions don't erase impact." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw it. Not guilt, not shame, just recognition of who I had become, of what he had lost, of the fact that I had built something he couldn't inherit, something not passed down, but pulled from the dirt with bloodied hands. Later that night, a woman approached me near the final installation. She was maybe in her 60s, with kind eyes and a voice that sounded like gravel softened by honey. "I brought my granddaughter," she said. "She's 17. Her mother ignores her, and she thinks that means she's worthless." She gestured to the golden chair. "She stood in front of that for 20 minutes, cried, then wrote something in your guest book." I felt my throat tighten. "Thank you for giving her a place to sit," she whispered. "A place to feel seen." You see, that's why I tell this story. Not for closure, not for applause, not for the faint hope that my family might one day truly understand, but for the girl who thinks she's invisible. The boy told he's too sensitive. The quiet sibling watching others get crowned with praise while they pick up broken glass with bare hands. This is for you, yes, you, the one watching, the one listening, the one thinking, could I ever do that? Could I ever become something more than what they said I'd be? Let me be clear, you already are. You just haven't seen your reflection in full light yet. They left the exhibit early, didn't even stay for the panel talk, but they saw enough to know they no longer defined the terms, that their absence no longer haunted me, it fueled me, and when I locked up that night, I looked at that golden chair one last time. It didn't need to be filled. It just needed to exist. A reminder to everyone watching, even when they don't give you a seat, you can build your own damn table. You don't realize how heavy victory is until you have to carry it. At first, success felt like helium, light and astonishing, lifting me above the wreckage of my past. But the higher I floated, the more eyes turned upward, their expectations hooking into me like fishing lines, each one begging for a piece of the ascent. When inheritance closed, the museum director called to say attendance had broken every quarterly record. Articles bloomed like wildflowers. The Guardian called me the patron saint of the disregarded, while an arts podcast dubbed me the heiress who bought her own crown. Nice headlines, sure, but crowns cut into the scalp if you wear them too long. And gravity, quiet and patient, never forgets your address. It began with the phone that wouldn't stop buzzing. Agents, boards, universities, TV, producers pitching docuseries where they could dramatize my childhood, with slow-motion violins and sepia-toned flashbacks. "We'll center empowerment," they promised. "We'll cut you a check." I should have felt flattered. Instead, I felt hunted, because every offer came with a subtext: sell us the shape of your scars, so we can profit from their outline. One morning I scrolled through 37 unread emails, all subject lines some version of collaboration, opportunity. I could almost hear my mother's voice, silky with caution. "Be careful, darling. People only love you when you're useful." For once, she wasn't entirely wrong, so I made a rule: integrity before exposure. If a proposal didn't serve the artists, the house, or the community, I passed no matter how glossy the paycheck. That's when the blowback started. A corporate sponsor, let's call them Ororotech, offered a 6-figure grant in exchange for brand integration throughout the residency. They wanted their logo on the garden sculpture, product placements in our live streams, and first refusal rights on any digital art produced here. I declined politely, and AuroraTech withdrew their existing donation, plus issued a statement implying I was ungrateful for corporate partnership. For a heartbeat, panic flared. Because funds matter. Paint isn't cheap. Housing isn't free. The residency thrived on a delicate braid of grants, private donors, and my own pockets. Losing AuroraTech punched a hole straight through the budget. Claire noticed my clenched jaw at dinner that night. "What's wrong?" she asked. I exhaled, told her everything. She considered, then said, "You taught me that boundaries are the price of respecting yourself. Pay the price." I stared at her, my once silent sister now handing my own lesson back to me like a mirror. She was right, so I paid. But the universe has a strange sense of humor. 2 days after AuroraTech's press release, my inbox flooded, again this time with micro-donations from strangers who had read their statement and smelled the coercion. $20, $50, sometimes just $5, and a note. Keep it pure. By week's end, we'd recovered every cent AuroraTech pulled, plus enough to fund a new fellowship for single parents. That night, as I transferred the funds, I thought, real support isn't loud, it's consistent. Speaking of consistency, resurfaced, he requested a meeting to discuss mutual interests. Translation: his real estate venture was tanking, and he needed capital. We met at a downtown cafe. Neutral ground. He arrived wearing failure like an ill-fitting coat, creases around his eyes. Credit card decline worries flickering behind politeness. He slid a folder across the table. Inside, balance sheets hemorrhaging red, a proposal for me to invest, and an unspoken plea that family loyalty might bridge his fiscal canyon. Once, those pleading eyes would have broken me. But compassion without boundaries is just self-harm, dressed as virtue. "I can't fund this," I said softly. He swallowed. "Even alone, especially not alone," I replied. "Debt will only dig you deeper unless you change the bedrock. What you need isn't money, it's a new model." I offered introductions to a nonprofit incubator, suggested pivoting the properties into affordable artist co-ops, ideas shaped by everything I'd learned clawing my way up. But investor cash? No. He looked away, pride flickering like a dying bulb. "You know," he murmured, "Dad would have fixed this for me." I met his gaze. Dad also built sandcastles on tides. Look where that got us. Silence sat between us like a mediator. Finally, he nodded once, small, reluctant respect glinting in the motion. We parted without rancor. Progress isn't always reconciliation. Sometimes it's simply understanding the new rules of orbit. That evening, I walked the halls of my house listening to paintbrushes hiss in water jars. Keys clack in the poetry loft, a cello's low hum drifting from the attic studio. Gravity, yes, heavy, but also grounding. I paused outside the Magnolia Suite, currently home to a ceramicist named Jada, who shaped grief into vessels so luminous they seemed lit from within. Through the cracked door, I saw her at the wheel, arms caked in clay. Smiling as if creation itself were a private joke. She finally understood, and I realized, this is worth every weight, every pulled muscle of the soul. Because success isn't a peak, it's a planet with its own pull. You learn to walk with new center, or you fall off the edge. Later, I recorded a message for the residency alumni network. No polished speech, just phone in hand, raw and real. "Hey family," I began. "If you're hearing rumors about sponsors vanishing, good, let them vanish. We'll build without them, like we always have. Our currency is courage. Our credit score is community. And trust me, that's inflation-proof." Within hours, replies poured in, offers to teach workshops, share equipment, host pop-up fundraisers. A dancer in Seoul live-streamed a rooftop performance, tips directed to our scholarship fund. A poet in Nairobi auctioned first-edition chapbooks. Artists who'd once felt like exiles now defended the walls that sheltered them. I watched the digital tide surge. And for the second time that month, tears found me quiet. Grateful tears, as I understood what legacy really means. Not statues, not street names, but people who will raise your flag when your arms are tired. Listen, US. You, sitting there wondering if your little victories matter. They do. Because every boundary you hold, every integrity tax you pay, plants a flag for someone behind you. They will see it and think, if she can refuse the easy money, maybe I can too. They will feel the magnet of your gravity and plot their course by its pull. That is how we rewrite galaxies. I ended the night under the magnolia tree, moonlight silvering its blossoms. I pressed my palm to the trunk and whispered, "You were Planted for me when I was born, now I plant shade for others. The wind rustled, soft approval. Victory is heavy, yes, but shared. It feels like wings. They said all I would get was a letter. No shares. No trust fund. No piece of the family land. Just one envelope with my name on it, handed to me like an afterthought the morning after the will was read. I almost didn't open it. For weeks, maybe months, it sat, untouched in the back of my desk drawer, tucked beneath residency contracts and grant applications, like a splinter I didn't want to feel. Because I knew, whatever it said, it would hurt. And then one gray morning, something in me shifted. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe closure. Maybe I was just tired of ghosts rattling their chains through my chest. So, I opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable, my father's, thick with that same broad, looping arrogance he used to sign mortgage documents and punishment slips. There were only 5 sentences, but each one sliced deeper than the last. I know this won't surprise you. David was always meant to inherit. You never had the killer instinct. I hope you find peace with whatever small life you make for yourself. Goodbye. No warmth, no affection, just the neat execution of expectation. I sat there holding that paper like a verdict. And for the first time in years, I laughed. Not bitterly, not wildly, just quietly, because he was right about one thing. I didn't have the killer instinct. I never learned how to crush others to rise. But I had something else. And that something built a house where people came not to beg for entry but to breathe. The strange thing was, after reading that letter, something else inside me unlatched. Not grief. I'd buried that years ago. Not anger. I'd burned through that, too. No. It was something simpler. Like walking into a room you forgot existed and realizing you'd left the light on. I went down to the basement that night. Not many people know. This house has a cellar beneath the cellar room bricked in behind the original wine vault, sealed off decades ago. The blueprints barely acknowledge it. The realtors never mentioned it, but I found it when the renovations began, and I kept its secret, a sort of vault for my mind. Inside, one lockbox. I'd filled it slowly over the years. Not with treasures, at least not the kind you'd fence or insure, just remnants of the life I was supposed to discard. A photograph of me at 17, hair still in braids, standing barefoot on the cliffs of Devon with a sketchbook. A pressed daffodil I'd stolen from my mother's garden the day she told me I wasn't wife material. My first exhibition brochure, folded a dozen times from being carried like a lucky charm. And now, the letter. I placed it in the box. Not with ceremony, just with finality. And then I did something I never thought I would. I added his photo, too. My father. The only one I kept. Not to honor him, but to document the soil I grew from. Even poisoned roots can yield wildflowers. Claire came down later, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She didn't ask why I'd been quiet. She just sat beside me and handed me a cup. I remember. She said softly, when I was 12 and you brought home that handmade pottery set from the thrift shop, you taught me how to center clay on a wheel using a YouTube video. I chuckled. That was a disaster. Yeah, we got mud on the ceiling, she grinned. But that was the first time I ever felt grounded. Like the world wasn't just spinning out of control. She looked at me. You've always made spaces like that for everyone. Even when no one made one for you. I looked at her, and I knew. The real inheritance wasn't money. It wasn't even the house, it was this. A ripple of resilience moving through the people who'd once been left behind. A home built not on land, but on recognition. A legacy not of things but of change. And still closure is tricky. Some part of me wanted my parents to see me now. To walk into the foyer and marvel at the sculptures. To witness David shaking my hand with respect, not rivalry. To see Claire flourishing. To hear a poet thank me for saving their life with a residency slot. But that part of me has learned. They never will, because even if they had lived to see it, they wouldn't have seen me. They would have seen an exception. A fluke. A black sheep who accidentally grew wings. They would have asked, what did you do with our name? Not realizing, I buried it, and in its place, I built something sacred. So I returned to the lockbox one last time. This time, not to add but to release. I took it to the river. Low tide. Clear sky. I opened the box. Removed only the daffodil and the photo of me on the cliff. The rest I fed to the current. Let the river take the weight I no longer needed. Then I stood there, barefoot in the mud, like that 17-year-old sketching the sea. Only now, I wasn't watching the horizon. I was the horizon. When I got home, there was a letter on the porch, no name, just to the owner of the house on Cliffside Lane. Inside, a handwritten note. I saw your exhibit. I've never cried in a gallery before. Thank you for proving there's power in being overlooked. My daughter just got her first art grant. She applied because she read your story. A grateful stranger, I held it close. This was the real estate I cared about, not deeds or wills, but footprints and hearts. If you're watching this, if you've ever been handed nothing but silence, dismissal, or a letter that feels like exile, please hear me. You don't need their inheritance to inherit your own worth. You don't need permission to bloom. You are the lockbox. You are the vault. You are the treasure. The world tried to write me off, so I picked up the pen and rewrote the ending. I used to think success looked like an invitation. A chair pulled out for me at a long, polished table where my family already sat, glasses full, voices raised in celebration, their backs straight with pride. I waited years for that. Waited for someone to notice the work. Waited for a seat to open up. Waited for anyone to say, you were right to believe in yourself. But that seat never came. The table was always full, not with love, but with legacy. And I wasn't part of the story they wanted to tell, so I stopped waiting. And I built my own table. It started as a metaphor. But then, one spring afternoon, I made it literal. I took old wood from the barn behind the house, beams warped with salt air and sunlight, and I sanded every one of them down with my own hands. I called it the gathering table, not for guests of honor, but for people like me. People who had been told, there's no room for you here. The day we finished it, Claire cried. She ran her hands along the grain, fingers tracing each knot and dent, like they were holy. It's beautiful, she whispered. I nodded, but said nothing, because in truth, it wasn't just beautiful. It was sacred. It was everything I had once begged for made real, on my terms. You see, when your entire life has been shaped by exclusion, you begin to think access is love. That being chosen means being worthy. That the only way to be seen is to squeeze yourself into a space someone else built for someone else. But I know better now. I didn't need their seat, their spotlight, their name. I needed to remember that I was never asking for too much. I was asking the wrong people. It started with one invitation. A letter to an old friend from university. Then another. A neighbor who'd been too afraid to share their poetry. An intern from the gallery who painted at night but never showed anyone. Every Friday, we'd gather around the table. Some came with tears still drying on their cheeks. Others came with nothing but silence. And one by one, we filled the air with stories. Not performative, not perfect, but real. One night, a young woman no older than I was when I left home stood up after dinner and said, my mother always told me my voice was too loud, that no one wanted to hear me. That if I wanted to be loved, I had to shrink. She looked at me across the table. You didn't shrink, and you're still here. Her voice cracked. So maybe I'll stay loud, too. We all applauded, and not the polite kind. The kind that says, we see you, we welcome you. We're building something new here. The irony. My family still hasn't called. Even now with the house restored. My work exhibited in galleries across the country. And the gathering table featured in a national design magazine. There's no letter. No voicemail. No apology. David sent a birthday card last month. It just said, congrats on the house, hope you're doing well. No return address. And I felt nothing, not anger, not sadness, just clarity. Because the love I craved never lived in them. It lived in the community I built when I stopped begging. It lived in every Friday night around that table. In every whispered story that turned into a roar. People ask me sometimes, what would you say to your father if he were still alive? I think I'd just smile and say, you were right about one thing. I didn't have the killer instinct, but I had something better. I had the creator's instinct. You built walls. I built windows. You hoarded land. I planted seeds. You built a family out of fear. I built a home out of welcome. And I'd leave it at that. The house on Cliffside Lane isn't just a house anymore. It's a sanctuary, a studio, a circle, a proving ground. Not of revenge, but of vision. We host workshops, now free, to anyone who's ever been told they weren't good enough. We offer food, shelter, even scholarships from a foundation I started with the profits from my last exhibition. It's called the Second Daughter Fund. Every time I sign a grant approval, I think, this could have been me. This was me. And I send it anyway because no one should have to prove their worth to eat, to learn, to hope, to hope. So this, I guess, is the end of the story. Or maybe the beginning of another. I don't know what my father imagined when he left me that letter. Maybe he thought I'd fade into obscurity. Maybe he thought I'd cling to the crumbs, beg for scraps, blame myself. But all he did was give me clarity. Sometimes, the greatest gift is the one you don't want, because it forces you to build the life you were meant to live, not the one someone tried to script for you. I am not their echo. I am not their disappointment. I am not their shame. I am my own genesis, my own rise, my own legacy. So let them keep their estate, their fortune, their dinner parties and bloodline boasts. I'll keep my table. And the people who sit at it, and that, my friend, is more than enough.